Hello guys, it's the Caribbean Bookworm, and today I'll be giving you a book review for Eteka, Rise of the Imamba, written by Ben Hinson. Before we continue on with the book review, I just want to show you guys one of the shirts I got from the author with one of the characters on it, which I'm wearing it respectfully for this book review. Eteka is a book written by Ben Hinson, and it's a historical fiction book that takes place during the Cold War era. Especially a major proportion of the story is based in Africa, Nigeria, and various other places. The story follows two different mercenaries throughout their journey within this particular mercenary guild called the Imamba. These mercenaries both experience different things that make them slowly but surely question their loyalty to the Imamba Brotherhood and whether or not they should stay within it or try to get out. Now, there are two mercenaries throughout the stories, but they seem to have some things in common, albeit in a different period of time, in which you start to noticing that their story is more interconnected than you'd think at first glance. Now, what I've just said there is one of the many things I've really enjoyed while reading this book, as this book brought different twists and turns of which I did not expect to happen, but they were nevertheless quite entertaining when they did happen. But keeping that in mind, we shall dive firstly into the pros of this book. The first pro I have with this book is the fact that the author did a lot of research while writing this book. The author mentioned several things, several local dishes, several African clothing styles, and especially those that were adequated during the period in which the story was set, which made this even a more engrossing read, especially if you're someone who's really looking for those like historical little niches and things that will pique your historical curiosity. A lot of times throughout the book, either in the form of a language or in the form of something that is very particular to a certain country or even a city, the author writes a certain note on the bottom of the page explaining or elaborating on something that was mentioned, and that adds even more to the story as you actually start to visualize the things quite clearly as to how the place must have looked, what the people must be like, what they're locally into, etc. So it is quite clear that the author did his research before writing this story in essence. The second pro I have with the book, and it's a major pro in my opinion, is the fast pace of the book. The book, although it's about 550 pages long or less, 540 pages long, it doesn't feel that way, at least for me. It feels like a really fast read. One of them is because the letters aren't that small, they're quite big in my opinion, so it reads quite easily. And two, the balance between dialogues and good action scenes are balanced, in my opinion, quite well in regards to this story. Sometimes there are dialogues introduced to get more depth for the characters, and sometimes there are a lot of action moments. So one thing I'd say for sure is if you're into really classic like 80s to 90s action movies with Sylvester Stallone and such, I think you'd really like this book. So either you'd like it for the historical aspect, since there are a lot of historical things that are well represented throughout this work of fiction, or you'd like it a lot for the simple fact that it feels like a classic good old action movie, like testosterone filled and such. And my third and last pro with this book is the simple fact that the protagonists are actually quite interesting, especially in my opinion Yisa. I think that's how you pronounce it, Yisa, I hope. Yisa is one of the two mercenaries of which I mentioned before, and you follow him. His story takes place at a time frame that's a bit earlier than that of Eteka's. You also see him going through the same doubts, the same problems, and as well regarding the fact that he has a family. So he really starts to question the motive behind the mercenaries and the brotherhood of which he's been working for quite a long time. That, along with Yisa's personal story with his wife and his best friend, made this even more peculiar. And if you're really into a juicy drama story, I think after quite a long time I haven't read such a juicy story as that of Yisa and his wife, and it's just his family that's living back in Nigeria. One other thing I want to add to this last pro is the simple fact that the story of Yisa and Eteka is so interwoven, and essentially near the end of the book you start to see why it was written that way. It makes everything make sense, and it makes for some really awesome revelations throughout your reading experience. So I found that to be quite an awesome pick for a writing style. Now that's it for my pros for the book. Now let's dive into the cons of the book, of which I have with the book. At least two cons I had with the book. First con being I wish some of the characters had more character development. Although throughout the book you have different things setting up for character development, so such as the culture, the people throughout the environment, certain political movements and thoughts that were being taught back then, I still thought that certain characters could have, of course, have more depth. Especially regarding the love interest of Yisa, I found that character to be really interesting, so I wanted to know more about her and the love interest for Eteka as well. Like she could have used more backstory as well. Hers was more lacking than that of Yisa, but for obvious reasons, the love interest for Yisa was more developed than that of Eteka. But I certainly felt that certain characters could have used more development, even aside the love interest for the two protagonists. My second and last con that I had with the book is related to the last point of which I mentioned during my pro, and that is that although the story for the two different protagonists were kind of separate and then became more interwoven, that also made it a bit more difficult to get into the story chronologically speaking, at least during the first parts of the book. During the first parts of the book, it was a bit confusing as to where we are, where does this exactly fit, etc. But then, as you read more and more through the book, you start noticing, oh, that person is that person. Oh, that makes sense here, this and that, and everything starts to click. So, because of that, and due to the fact that I actually read this like really quickly, because it was actually really quite entertaining, it wasn't that confusing for me because the book was still like really fresh through my mind. It's like, oh, I could easily connect the dots, but I can easily see if you're someone who's more of a slow reader and you're going to read this in a broader like span of time, that it might be confusing sometimes to like get back into the story or remember what happened here and there. But those cons aside, I found this book to be quite interesting. It's not usually my cup of tea, like reading a more like heavy action-packed type of book. I'm usually more of a horror, thriller, fantasy, sci-fi type of person, but this was an enjoyable read, and I actually look forward to reading more books like this. For what I figured from this is that basically Eteka is meant to be a series, so the author perhaps in the near future is planning to publish more books like this. And if that's the case, I'm really willing to read those other books because the story built up quite a bit of lore too throughout the story of the mercenaries and such, and I found that interesting. I really want to know more of what is going on within this world, what essentially the main protagonist is going to unravel in the future. So that's it for my book review, guys. This was Eteka, Rise of the Imamba. On Goodreads, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I was contemplating at first, during the first half of the book, I was contemplating giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, but as I read further, the book actually grew on me, and there were some really clever writing elements that were used, and just the story in general became more engaging. So, hence, I gave it a 0.5 higher mark than I was originally going to give it. So, yeah. Hope you guys enjoy my book review and stay tuned for more. Bye.